In this video, we're going to look at sheet mulching myths and some of the concerns you might have. Sheet mulching is a process to convert a lawn or a weedy area into a garden. What you do is you take some newspaper or cardboard, put it down on the soil, put some mulch on top, and that could be compost, mulch, grass clippings, wood chips, soil. People use all kinds of things on top of the cardboard and paper. And then you let it sit. You wait until the weeds and the grass underneath die and that paper decomposes, and then you have a nice bed to plant in. This method has become very popular, and along with popularity, you get myths. And I'm going to debunk those myths right now. The first thing to understand is that this is a two-step process. You put down some paper, newspaper or cardboard, and then you put some organic matter on top. A lot of the claims people make for sheet mulching is due to the mulch, not the sheeting. The paper and newspaper is the sheeting, the stuff on top is the mulch. And mulch brings its own benefits, but people have taken those benefits and ascribed them to the paper itself. Let's dig down deep underneath that sheeting and find out what's really going on. The claim is made that paper and newspaper are good for the garden. They add all kinds of nutrients to it. But how many nutrients do they really have? Well, if you look at cardboard, it has a nitrogen level of 0.1%. Phosphorus is 0.03%. Potassium is almost non-existent. Now, it does have some calcium, and that's at 0.15%. These numbers are extremely low for fertilizer, and they're in the order of 1/10 of what you get in compost. Paper is not nutritious. It doesn't add nutrients to soil. Here's another myth I hear all the time. Earthworms love to eat paper. They love nibbling on that cardboard. Well, that's a myth too. If you've ever done any vermicomposting, you'll know that the bedding material you use is paper-based. Shredded newspaper, shredded cardboard. That's where they live. And then you put some food in, and the earthworms eat the food. They don't eat the bedding. Now, if the food runs out and they're starving, they will finally eat some of the paper because there's a very small amount of nutrition in those. If earthworms have a choice, they don't eat paper. Earthworms don't love paper. How long does it take for this newspaper and cardboard to decompose? I went online and found all kinds of people that claim it decomposes in 2 to 4 weeks. Well, let's use some compost science to understand this more thoroughly. When we're building a compost pile, the perfect CN ratio, carbon to nitrogen, is 30 to 1. You want 30 times as much carbon as nitrogen. And if you get that ratio right, the material decomposes very quickly. Now, you might know that CN ratio as the browns and greens, which is a generalized way of talking about the same thing. Well, what is the CN ratio of cardboard? We want a 30 to 1. Well, it turns out cardboard has a ratio of 560 to 1. It has 18 times too much carbon. What that means is that it will decompose very slowly. In fact, in my experience in zone 5, it takes at least a year to decompose. Newspaper in a single sheets is a little faster, but if you put a whole bunch of newspaper sheets together, it's slow too. The reason is there's not enough nitrogen in there for the carbon that's in there. That's basic compost science. This sheeting material is very slow to decompose. Lots of people claim that newspaper and cardboard are great for building healthy soil, but that's a myth. You now know that this material contains no nutrients, almost no nitrogen, and it's nitrogen that the microbes and plants need in soil. That's what creates a healthy soil, is a good amount of nitrogen. Now, cardboard and newspaper does add a bit of carbon, but the amount it's adding is really quite small. There are so many better ways to build good soil, and mulch and compost are certainly much better than paper. What about termites? I see a lot of people claiming that the cardboard attracts termites to your garden. Well, that's sort of true and sort of not true. Let's start by understanding where termites like to live. They like areas that are dark and moist, and wet newspaper and cardboard under a mulch is just perfect for that. It's a great place to live. But here's the thing, it doesn't really attract termites. So if you have termites over in the neighbor's yard, they're not coming over to your yard because you used cardboard. Now, if you have termites in your yard and you put cardboard or newspaper down, they will tend to live underneath it. I mean, that's what they're always doing. They're always looking for a great place to live. So if you have termites, you have the problem anyways. The cardboard isn't going to make things a lot worse. If you don't have termites, it's not going to attract. Now let's have a look at some concerns that people have about using paper in the garden. And the main one is chemicals. In North America, the ink that's used for newspaper has been plant-based for quite a few years. It's perfectly safe. Even colored paper uses plant-based inks, and it's perfectly safe. If the paper is shiny, it may have some other chemicals in there. So stay away from the shiny colored paper. What about cardboard? Well, it really depends on the type of cardboard we're talking about. If we're looking at corrugated cardboard, that's the material used in shipping boxes. The glue in that is starch-based, perfectly safe. If you're looking at paper from things like cereal boxes, it's a thinner cardboard and it has colored printing on it. That does contain some chemicals. So if you're concerned about chemicals, don't use that kind of cardboard. Now, I've written a complete article about this on my blog, gardenmyths.com, and the article is called, "Is It Safe to Compost Paper and Cardboard?" And it goes into this chemical concern in a lot of detail. Bottom line, it's really not as big a concern as you think it is. Another concern that I've seen raised is this idea that the cardboard keeps air out of the soil. It stops the exchange of gases between the air and the soil. I first heard about this concern on the professor's blog. They made the point that sheet mulching should not be used because it stops the movement of gases between the soil and the air. Basically, your soil gets stagnant and things start dying off. Now, after a few years, I cornered them and I specifically asked them for scientific research to prove their claim. They came back and said, well, this really hasn't been studied by science yet. Now, that was a few years ago. Since then, a scientific paper did get published that looked at this problem, and one of the professors' name is actually on the paper. I'll put their conclusion on the screen so you can read it in detail. In short, what it's saying is cardboard sheet mulching does not significantly affect oxygen and CO2 levels in the soil. This idea that cardboard stops the exchange of gases is not a real concern. A third concern has to do with water getting to the soil under the paper. Now, this concern is valid. When it rains, the rain will come down. It'll go through the mulch. It'll hit the cardboard or paper, and then it runs sideways, looking for a place to enter the soil. So it's quite true that this sheeting material stops water from getting to the soil. On the flip side, though, it also stops water from evaporating from the soil. And depending on your environmental conditions, this may actually keep more water in the soil. So although the shedding water is a problem during a rain, and if you water by hand, generally this isn't as big a concern as people think. Where it might be a real concern is in very dry climates, where the soil has very little moisture in it to start with. So it's a very good idea to water your garden thoroughly, really deeply, before you put on the sheet mulching. The last concern I'd like to look at deals with tape and labels. These are stuck on top of the cardboard. Now, neither one is really a concern as far as the health of your soil or the food you might grow in this garden. The problem really has to do with the fact that these things decompose much slower than the cardboard. So now you're at a point where the cardboard's all decomposed and you still have these bits of plastic from the tape and labels and things sitting in your soil. So it is a good idea to remove these before you use that cardboard. If you don't, it really won't harm anything. All right, we've looked at some myths and some concerns, and now it's time to ask the most important question. Should you be using sheet mulching? And the answer is, it depends. The first scenario I'd like to look at is the case where you have a lawn and you want to turn it into a garden. Or you might just have a whole bunch of weeds and you want to turn that into a garden. That's a great time to use sheet mulching. Put down the paper, put mulch on top, let it all decompose. You'll end up with a good garden with very few weeds, very few grass. That's a good way to use it. The problem is people are starting to use this technique for a different scenario, and that is they're using it on an annual basis to try and control weeds. If you want to know if this is a good idea, have a look at my next video, which is right here.